Afternoon, everyone. Sorry this one is coming out a bit later today. Unfortunately, I had a few recording issues with the original video and couldn't muster up the energy to re-record the lecture. So it's coming to you now after about a gap of about a day or so, so apologies. So today we will cover the history of gender issues during the French Revolution, with a particular focus on women and the changing perceptions of womanhood during the period. The years of the Revolution were utterly transformative for women in some regards, whilst also retaining many of the same abuses and disparities in power that defined traditional gender roles. Before 1789, women largely lived in subservience to men throughout Europe. Educated women were taught only those skills deemed useful for helping them to get a husband. Uneducated women, who remained the vast majority, were expected to have children and nurture their early upbringing, whilst also either helping their husbands in the field or developing separate skills, such as using a spinning wheel at home. These so-called homespun skills often brought poor families more income than the father's employment did and became vital to sustain families in time of hardship. Enlightenment thinkers increasingly spoke out against the status of women in Europe. A man does not invariably have more strength of body, of wisdom, of mind, or of conduct than a woman, wrote Louis de Jaucourt in 1756. Meanwhile, both Russia and Great Britain were ruled by effective female leaders, most notably Empress Catherine the Great. Middle and upper class women in urban centres ran salons in which the latest political developments could be discussed and debated, earning these women a degree of fame and influence. Some Enlightenment thinkers, however, resented the women of the salons, and salacious rumours were often spread about them. Rousseau had a famously poor view of women, especially those who spoke up against men. As we discussed previously, much sexist propaganda was also used to attack high-profile female leaders such as Marie Antoinette. Women played an important part in the outbreak and early development of the French Revolution, forming part of the various revolutionary mobs and gatherings wherever these happened to form. In particular, women's early demands were framed in economic terms, utilizing traditional themes of women as protectors of the domestic sphere. The most famous example of women's activism was the March on Versailles in October 1789, very early in the Revolution. The march began as a response to the high price of bread in Paris, which outraged women shopping in the Parisian marketplace, but from the start it also had a political impetus, with liberal women stirring up a crowd and heading it towards the king's royal palace of Versailles. The women brought back the king with them, ending the power of the monarchy and solidifying the importance of the mob in future developments. Women's position in the famous Declaration of Rights of Man passed by the French National Assembly in 1789 was unclear, as you shall see from your primary reading. Women objected to this lack of clarity, writing a series of pamphlets and speeches which called for a greater role for themselves in the deliberations of the Assembly. One of the most prominent women's voices was that of Olympe de Gouges, who responded to the Declaration of Rights with a famous pamphlet of her own, the Declaration of the Rights of Women and of the Female Citizen. Gouges called for women to have equal citizenship rights as men, as they were the equals of men. Just like men, women were born with sacred rights which no man could justly divulge them of. She listed 17 articles or rights that women should be allowed to have. As well as those familiar to us, such as the right to vote or sit in the National Assembly, these rights included the right to publicly name an absentee father of a child and thus hold them responsible for a child's upbringing. The stipulation that women should be allowed to own and pass down property to other women was a guarantor of women's economic status. The document also stipulated provisions for widows and younger women who had been tricked into false relationships. None of the articles in this extraordinary document were, however, accepted. Another notable woman from the early revolutionary period was Pauline Leon, a chocolate merchant by trade and a political radical. Leon appealed to the National Assembly to make women full citizens. This request was denied, firstly by default and then explicitly in the Constitution. Leon next appealed to the Assembly to allow women to serve in a militia to defend Paris from the invading armies of the Prussians and the Austrians, and to train under the National Guard. This request was also denied, perhaps due to the links between carrying arms and holding citizenship, or perhaps because of traditional conceptions of war as a masculine sphere. As the revolution progressed, it was clear that the now dominant Jacobin faction would be no more willing to listen to revolutionary women than the early constitutionalists in the National Assembly had been. The Jacobins forbade the use of meeting halls for women's groups and widely ignored women's suggestions, continuing to see citizenship as a privilege of men alone. On May 10th, 1793, the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women was formed by Pauline Leon. It was a feminist society and saw its role as defending the revolution. The society was very active in Parisian politics, generally supporting far-left and populist policies and shouting down centre and rightist platforms from the galleries. Dressed in red caps, women in the society were also present in the streets of Paris, where they proudly displayed their views. Charlotte Corday was a Norman woman descended from an unimportant line of minor aristocrats. Following the Revolution, she threw her support behind the moderate Girondin faction, who spoke out against the violence of the Jacobins and wished to slow down the Revolution's most radical changes. She grew in popularity in Girondin circles, her rise itself an example of how women could exercise political agency during the time of revolution. She was most famous, however, for the murder of journalist Jean-Paul Marat, a Parisian radical whose writings helped to push the revolution in a more radical direction. Corday claimed to know of a Girondin plot and gained entrance to Marat's house, where the journalist was working from the bathtub. She stabbed him twice, killing him. Corday's subsequent trial was a high-profile event. "I have killed one man to save 100,000, she said before a series of judges. The Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, who supported Marat's left-wing policies, paraded his bloody bathtub through the streets of Paris to encourage outrage at his murder. Following her execution via guillotine, Corday became a heroine for the moderate cause, whilst attracting the loathing of the Parisian mobs. Whilst moderates used the murder to advance the cause of women, for revolutionaries, Corday's actions risked unbalancing the feminist slant that they had sought to bring to the revolution, and encouraged criticism that women had been given too many freedoms and had taken things too far. The Society of Revolutionary Republican Women began to make urgent calls for authoritarian policies to protect national security and to protect the revolution, many of which were considered too radical, even by the Jacobins. Some of the policies also made little sense. The society ensured that a law was passed stipulating that all women in France were to wear a red, white and blue cocarde to signify their patriotism and loyalty to the revolution. This decision was unpopular with the ordinary women of France, many of whom resented being told what to wear by the radicals who claimed to speak for them. Women wearing the cocarde began to fight those who did not on the streets of French cities. By October, the now unpopular society was officially dissolved by the Jacobin government. There followed a period of crackdown in which the Jacobins emphasized that a woman's place was in the domestic sphere rather than on the streets. The most common punishment for women continuing to engage in politics after this point was public shaming and ridicule. However, some women were executed via the guillotine. Olympe de Gouges and salon owner and moderate Madame Roland were among those who joined the ranks of Marie Antoinette on the scaffold. "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name," said Roland shortly before being beheaded. In 1790's London, meanwhile, a series of radical women wrote treatises denouncing male supremacy. Mary Wollstonecraft, Damaris Cudworth, and Catherine Macaulay all argued for greater opportunities for women in non-domestic settings, particularly in the field of education. Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, written in 1792, argued that women often appeared out of their depth in political settings due to poor education practices, which raised them on irrelevant subjects and left them tied to male opinions. If women received the same education as men, Wollstonecraft argued, then they would be able to contribute as much towards society, as well as continuing to be excellent mothers. None of the English women radicals were as revolutionary as their Parisian counterparts, but all put forward their views in creative, engaging ways, and their books were initially very popular, at least outside of Parliament. Napoleon's view of women was generally negative. It should be remembered that Napoleon was very much a general before anything else, and military conflict, at least as Napoleon conceived it, was very much a masculine arena. He thus did not have an overly large amount of respect for women or their potential, preferring to see them in regard to how many soldiers they could birth for his numerous wars. The Napoleonic Code did stipulate a few terms regarding a woman's status. The code led to an increase in women's rights, especially regarding property and inheritance, but fell well short of ideals of equality. A woman could be, for example, sentenced to 3 months in jail for adultery where her husband could escape punishment for the same crime. Equality could never be achieved whilst there was this disparity in full rights. Napoleon took a keen interest in the articles of his code covering divorce. His first marriage to Empress Josephine was fructuous, and he divorced her in 1810. "I truly loved my Josephine, but I did not respect her," said the emperor. Her name would, however, be the last thing he ever uttered on his deathbed. Outside of the Napoleonic Empire and its client states, women enjoyed few rights at all. Neither did men, for that part, but the status of women remained entirely inferior. Russia led the way here. In 1782, the law in Russia reinforced women's responsibility to obey her husband, and after the French Revolution in 1818, things had not got better, as marital separation was forbidden. By 1832, things were even worse, and women were now obliged to provide unlimited obedience to their husbands. In Germany, there were few reforms, but demographic changes helped to end the institution of arranged marriage that had been common, giving women at least a greater amount of control over their own marriage and partner. So Napoleon's code, whilst it was greatly unjust, did help women to seize more opportunities than those available to them elsewhere in Europe. Finally, LGBT issues in Europe remained little understood. In 1791, revolutionary France took the bold step of legalizing sodomy. This thus legalized sex between two consenting gay men. Prussia didn't go as far, but it did at least remove the death penalty for sodomy in 1796. So-called molly houses began to emerge in British cities, especially London. These houses functioned as proto-gay bars where homosexual and cross-dressing men could frequent and be themselves away from a judgmental society. For the most part, these molly houses were taverns or coffee houses, but increasingly they did also function as brothels. In Russia, LGBT laws were actually more liberal than in most of Europe, with a real crackdown of homosexual behaviour not coming until the 1830s.